Under the rain-streaked sky of Seattle on a Thursday afternoon that began like any other, Clara Hastings stood in the middle of Discovery Park with her heart pounding against the cage of her ribs like it was trying to escape. She would later remember every detail: the bite of wind off Puget Sound, the rustle of golden leaves tumbling over gravel, the scent of wet cedar, and most of all, the way Jake wouldn't look her in the eye when he said it. "We need to talk." 3 words, software deceptive. Final. Clara wasn't naive. Not exactly. But she had believed in things, maybe too easily. Love, promises. The idea that when someone saw you, really saw you, they wouldn't look away. Especially not when things got complicated. Jake Rowan had seen her once. Or at least it felt that way. Sophomore year, English Lit. He was the guy everyone wanted. Varsity soccer star, class clown charm, the kind of boy who could turn detention into a party. She was the quiet girl who wrote poems in the margins of her textbooks and stayed after class to help the teacher organize her desk. And yet, somehow, impossibly, they collided. It started with a joke about the Great Gatsby. She'd laughed. He noticed. Then came study sessions, long walks home, late-night texts that stretched into whispered phone calls under blankets, dreams stitched together like patchwork, Portland lofts, a bookstore cafe, shared tattoos, maybe a dog named Hemingway. They kissed in the rain, promised forever in the back of his beat-up Chevy. They even had names for their imaginary future kids. Now, as Jake stared off at the sound, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his Patagonia jacket, those dreams began to crack like thin ice. "It's not that I don't care about you," he mumbled. "Then why are you doing this?" Clara asked, voice splintering. Jake looked at the ground, kicked a pebble, didn't answer. Instead, he said something that would echo in Clara's chest for years. "This, us, it's holding me back." Just like that, he was gone. No dramatic exit, no goodbye kiss, just the sound of his footsteps fading down the trail. And Clara? She didn't cry. Not right away. She stood still as if rooted to the spot. Her breath turned visible in the cold, and all she could think was how wrong the world looked now. The park, once their haven, felt haunted. Every tree seemed to whisper what she already feared. "You are alone." The ache didn't hit all at once. It came in waves. That night she lay awake in her twin bed, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars she'd pasted to her ceiling years ago, and wondered if she'd imagined it all. The love, the future, the boy who'd once promised her the moon. A week later, she threw up in the bathroom. At first, she thought it was the flu, or heartbreak, or both. Then the test. 2 pink lines. The world didn't just tilt, it collapsed. At 17, Clara was pregnant, and she was going to tell her parents. But wait. Before we go any further, if you've made it this far and your heart is already pounding a little faster, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this aren't easy to tell, but with your support, we'll keep bringing more true, raw, and unforgettable journeys to life. Now, back to Clara. She didn't tell them right away. Days passed. She practiced the words in her head, how to say it, when to say it. But there's no soft way to drop a bomb. So she chose dinner. Roast chicken night, a Thursday tradition. Her father, Thomas, read the Seattle Times while her mother, Susan, fussed with the napkins like she was setting a royal table. Clara sat between them, a storm in her gut, her fork trembling in her hand. "I need to tell you something." Her voice was too quiet. Thomas glanced up. Susan didn't even pause the spoonful of mashed potatoes. "I'm pregnant," she said. This time louder. The air changed, like someone had opened a window in the middle of a blizzard. Thomas's newspaper slid to the floor. Susan dropped the spoon. Gravy splashed across the linen. "What did you say?" her mother asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I'm pregnant," Clara repeated. "It's Jake's. But he's gone. I'm keeping it." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then thunder. "You're 17. Susan shouted, pushing back from the table. "How could you do this? Do you have any idea what this means?" Thomas stood slowly. "You've disgraced this family." "I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did happen," he snapped. "And now? You expect to stay here? Raise a child under this roof?" "I have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem," he said, voice like ice. "Pack your things, Clara. You're on your own now." "And Susan?" She didn't speak, just turned away, tears streaming down her cheeks. Clara didn't scream, didn't beg. She walked to her room, zipped up a duffel bag, and folded the photo of her and Jake at the summer fair into a pocket she never used. At midnight, she stepped out into the rain. No umbrella, no goodbye. She walked alone through the sleepy streets of Seattle, past the glowing windows of houses that still felt whole, and knew, really knew, for the first time, what it meant to have everything fall apart. But sometimes, when things break, they don't stay broken. They shift. Transformation. Clara didn't know it yet, but this ending, it was also a beginning. Now here's a question for you, one to make you think. If you were in Clara's shoes, do you think she should A. Try to reach back out to Jake and tell him the truth, hoping for support? B. Focus only on herself and her child, cutting ties completely? Drop your answer, A or B, in the comments below. We want to know what you would do. And now, let's keep going. Because where Clara ends up next will change everything. The pregnancy test had been lying at the bottom of Clara's backpack for 3 days, untouched but impossible to ignore. Each time she reached for a pen or her notebook, her fingers brushed against its cold plastic edges. She hadn't told a soul, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't yet breathe under the weight of what she feared was true. On the 4th night, after her parents had gone to bed and the world outside the window was dim and silent, she crept into the bathroom. She locked the door and sat on the floor, her back pressed against the cold tile wall. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the test. Her breath hitched with each second that passed. 2 pink lines. They bloomed on the strip with cruel certainty. She didn't cry, not at first. She just stared. Then stared harder. Maybe if she looked long enough, the lines would fade. Maybe it was a mistake. But it wasn't. Something inside her, something ancient and undeniable, already knew. She was pregnant. She was 17. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. Clara sank back against the wall, knees pulled tight to her chest. The silence was louder than any scream she could have let out. She thought of Jake. Of course she did. Of his face that day in the park. Of the way he'd said, "This is holding me back," like she was a weight around his ankle instead of the girl who'd once known every secret of his heart. She wondered if she should tell him, but the answer came quickly. He was gone. He'd made that clear. And if he couldn't stand beside her when things got hard, what difference would it make now? Her thoughts turned to her parents. Thomas and Susan Hastings were not cruel people, not in the overt storybook way. They were devout, disciplined, and deeply concerned with appearances. There had always been an invisible rule book in the Hastings household. Order was safety. Silence was strength. And shame was something to be feared above all else. There was no rulebook chapter on a 17-year-old daughter with a baby on the way. Clara waited 3 more days. During that time, she lived in a strange limbo, attending school, helping her mom fold laundry, smiling when her dad commented on college applications. But inside, she was a house with its foundations cracked, just waiting for the collapse. On Sunday night, she decided to tell them. Dinner was baked salmon with lemon and dill, Susan's idea of Sunday comfort food. They ate in near silence, interrupted only by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional question about grades or whether Clara had heard back from the University of Washington. Then Clara cleared her throat. Her voice came out small, barely there. "I need to tell you something." Thomas looked up first. Susan kept chewing, Clara's fingers curled around her napkin. "I'm pregnant." The room froze. Time seemed to stretch and contract all at once. Susan dropped her fork. It hit the plate with a sharp clang. Thomas's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked like a man trying to solve an equation and realizing he didn't know the numbers. Clara went on, fast, before she could lose her nerve. It's Jake's, but he's gone. He doesn't know. I haven't told anyone else. I thought you should be the first to know. There was silence, heavy, punishing. Then Susan stood, slowly, as if in a daze. She walked around the table, one hand bracing herself on the back of her chair, and stared at her daughter like she didn't recognize her. Her voice, when it came, was thin and trembling. You've ruined your life. Clara flinched as if struck. Thomas stood too. He wasn't shouting yet, but his voice carried a different kind of weight, cold, sharp-edged authority. How far along? 6 weeks, Clara whispered. And you think keeping it is a good idea? I don't know what I think, Clara said, except that it's mine. And I don't want to get rid of it. I can't. Susan let out a choked sound halfway between a sob and a gasp. You're 17. You don't get to decide this on your own. Thomas turned his gaze on her, and for the first time in her life, Clara saw no warmth there, only disappointment. You made this choice. Now live with it, but not under our roof. Clara stared at him. You're kicking me out? You've made it clear you don't want our guidance, he said. So don't expect our shelter. We have expectations in this house, and you violated every one of them. Susan still hadn't sat down. Her face had gone pale. What will people say? She murmured as if the opinion of others was the worst part of it all. Church, your school, my co-workers. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. You're more worried about what the neighbors will say than what happens to me? You embarrassed us, her father said, every word like a slap. You lied. You betrayed our trust. I didn't lie, Clara said, voice shaking. I was scared. Well, Thomas said, walking away from the table, you should be. Clara stumbled back to her room, tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. She couldn't breathe. Her chest ached with something beyond heartbreak. She grabbed a duffel bag and started stuffing clothes inside with no plan, no direction, just the knowledge that she wasn't welcome anymore. As she zipped the bag, she looked around the room that had held her childhood. The posters on the wall, the stuffed rabbit on the dresser, the photo of her and Jake at the county fair tucked into the mirror. All of it suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, someone naive, someone gone. When she stepped outside, the night air hit her like a slap. It was colder than she expected, sharp with the early scent of winter. She didn't know where she was going, just away. Away from the house that no longer felt like a home, away from the people who had once sworn to protect her no matter what. She walked to the bus stop, her duffel heavy over her shoulder, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, hands trembling, until she found the name she hadn't called in over a year. Nora, her father's estranged mother. Clara had memories of her, faint but comforting. Summer weekends in Eugene, lemon cookies, classical music playing in a cluttered house, a woman with strong opinions and stronger arms, the kind of grandmother who always had a blanket waiting and never asked too many questions. She pressed call. It rang once, then twice, then a voice, rough, familiar, steady. Clara? Clara opened her mouth and everything spilled out at once. I'm sorry it's so late. I need somewhere to go. Please. Can I come? There was only a pause, then the sound of Nora shifting in her chair. Of course you can, she said. Get here safe. I'll keep the porch light on. And just like that, Clara had somewhere to go. She stepped onto the bus before sunrise, her fingers still clutching the phone, her eyes swollen from crying, her heart heavier than it had ever been. But underneath all the pain, all the grief, something had begun to stir, a flicker of defiance. She wasn't done yet, not even close. Under the washed-out glow of a Greyhound station just after sunrise, Clara stepped off the bus into the stillness of Eugene, Oregon. Her legs ached from the long ride, her eyes red and dry, but it wasn't the physical weight that pulled her down. It was everything else: loss, fear, the gnawing uncertainty of what came next. She tightened the grip on her duffel bag and scanned the empty lot, heart hammering, until she saw a figure wrapped in a blue wool coat, standing beneath a flickering lamppost. Nora Hastings, her grandmother, hadn't changed much in the years since Clara had last seen her. She was smaller than Clara remembered, but sturdier somehow, like an old oak tree that still weathered storms with a kind of quiet defiance. Her silver hair was pulled into a messy bun, her posture upright but easy. She didn't say anything at first. She simply opened her arms. Clara walked into the embrace like a child seeking shelter, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to be held. Nora didn't press, didn't ask questions. She just squeezed Clara tight and murmured, "You're safe now." "Let's get you warm." Nora's house sat on the edge of a town, a brick cottage with ivy crawling up one wall and wind chimes dancing in the breeze. It smelled like lemon soap, old paperbacks, and chamomile. The same worn plaid couch still held its permanent dent from years of Sunday naps, and the kitchen table was covered in crossword puzzles and tea mugs. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, but it felt like exactly what Clara needed, a place untouched by shame or silence. For the first few days, Clara barely spoke. She helped fold laundry, stared out the window for hours, or curled up under an afghan Nora had knitted years ago, letting the quiet carry her. Nora didn't push her to open up. She simply made space. She made soup. She played Debussy on her old stereo in the evenings and watered the winter herbs on the windowsill. It was the kind of healing Clara didn't realize she needed. Not fast, not loud, but real. On the 6th morning, Clara found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, one hand resting on the small, flat stretch of her belly. She wasn't showing yet, not really, but she could feel the difference. The knowing. There was life there. A future. She walked into the kitchen where Nora was kneading dough. "I'm going to keep it," Clara said. Nora didn't stop kneading. "I figured you might," she replied simply. "You've always had more fight in you than you think." Clara sat down, suddenly overcome with a wave of gratitude that caught her off guard. "Thank you for not sending me away, for not yelling, for this." Nora looked up, her eyes soft but steady. "Clara, you are not the mistake, and neither is that baby. People get scared and call love a mess, but that doesn't make it any less sacred." As the weeks rolled into months, Clara began to settle into a rhythm she didn't expect. She picked up part-time hours at a used bookstore downtown, where the owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Maureen, had taken one look at Clara's resume, then her eyes, and said, "You've been through hell? That makes you qualified for just about anything." Clara shelved books, swept floors, and organized poetry readings in the back corner. She started journaling again, filling pages with raw, unfiltered emotion. Every tip she earned went into a glass jar she kept on the nightstand labeled "for the baby." Nora drove her to doctor's appointments, sat in on ultrasounds, and told stories about raising Clara's father when he was a boy, how stubborn he was, how he once painted their living room wall blue because he'd read that blue makes you smarter. It was during one of those appointments in early spring, when the buds on the cherry trees outside had just started to bloom, that Clara heard the heartbeat for the first time. Fast, strong, steady, like tiny wings beating inside her. Her own heart clenched. Later that night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and imagining a future. Not the one she'd dreamed up with Jake, city skylines and shared espresso, but something simpler, more rooted. A child laughing in Nora's garden. A bookshelf filled with lullabies. A new version of herself reshaped by something deeper than fear. In mid-August, during a stretch of heavy heat and restless air, Clara went into labor. It started quietly, just a trickle of water, a slow tightening across her belly as she washed dishes in Nora's kitchen. At first, she thought it was a cramp. Then it hit again, sharper. "Grandma," she called, trying to stay calm. "I think it's time." Nora didn't panic. She grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed together weeks earlier, helped Clara into the car, and peeled down the highway like a woman who'd done this before. Sacred Heart Medical Center came into view just as the pain began to take her breath. The hours that followed blurred together in a fog of sweat, tears, and deep primal effort. Nurses came and went, lights dimmed. Clara's hand gripped Nora's so tightly she left nail marks. The pain split her open, but something else did too, something ancient and transformative. And then, at 3:12 a.m., under the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights and the scent of antiseptic, a cry broke through the quiet. The nurse placed him on Clara's chest, and time stopped. He was tiny, pink, furious. His fists flailed, his lungs strong. His hair was a thick, dark mop, matted with sweat and the start of life. Clara stared down at him, her arms trembling. She didn't cry right away. She just stared. Then slowly, almost like a secret, she whispered, "Miles. Your name is Miles." Nora leaned over, eyes full of wonder. "Well, hello there, Miles. We've been waiting for you." Clara held him close, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, the weight of him anchoring her to something real and sacred. All the shame, all the heartbreak, all the questions, they didn't disappear. But they dimmed. Because in that moment, there was only this: breath, blood, love. When they returned home 2 days later, the world had changed. The house felt smaller but fuller. There were bottles on the counter, a bassinet by the couch, and lullabies playing on a loop from Nora's old stereo. Clara barely slept. Miles woke every 3 hours with a howl, like a ship lost at sea. Her body ached. Her mind spun. But somehow through the exhaustion, she felt stronger than she ever had. Nora caught her one morning, standing in the doorway of Miles's room, whispering lines from a lullaby she'd made up the night before. "You're a natural," Nora said, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Clara shook her head. "I don't know what I'm doing." "None of us do, but you're doing it anyway. That's what matters." And so Clara Hastings, once the girl cast out into the night with nothing but a bag and a breaking heart, became something more. A mother, a fighter, a builder of something no one else could define for her. Not even the people who once turned her away. The first few weeks after bringing Miles home were a blur of half-slept nights, laundry piles that never seemed to shrink, and moments of piercing beauty that struck Clara so deeply she couldn't find words for them. He was small, but loud, a constant heartbeat in the center of her world. Nora had rearranged the house to make room for the bassinet, and though she never said it, Clara knew she did it without hesitation, without judgment. There was love in every detail. A lamp added near the crib. A rocking chair found at a thrift shop. Extra blankets folded neatly beside the changing table. Clara hadn't expected motherhood to feel like this, an odd mixture of constant motion and the deepest stillness. Like she'd fallen into a rhythm that wasn't hers alone anymore. Miles, even in those early days, had a presence about him. He stared up at her with eyes that were too focused for a newborn, as if he'd arrived already understanding more than she did. Clara often found herself talking to him late at night, not baby talk, but real conversation. She told him about the dreams she used to have, about books she loved, music that made her cry. She told him about the people who had left and the ones who stayed. She whispered into his soft, dark hair that he was wanted fiercely and forever. Money, though, was a constant pressure. Clara returned to page-turners when Miles was just 2 months old, working afternoons while Nora watched him. It wasn't glamorous and the hours were short, but it gave Clara something more than a paycheck. It gave her a place to remember she was still herself. Between shelving books and chatting with regulars, she found brief glimpses of the girl she'd been before everything changed. Maureen, the bookstore owner, let her bring Miles in once a week during slow shifts. He'd sleep curled in a sling across Clara's chest as she organized the poetry section, humming softly under her breath. Clara began to write again. She filled pages during nap times, poems, fragments, full confessions. They weren't polished, but they were honest. Nora read them when Clara wasn't looking, quietly placing encouraging notes in the margins. "You've got something here," she'd say over tea, tapping one of Clara's notebooks. "Don't hide it from the world." Slowly, Clara let herself imagine more than just surviving. She bought a coffee can at the dollar store and labeled it in black permanent marker, Miles's future. Into it, she slipped every spare dollar, every tip from late customers who stayed too long at the shop. It wasn't much. A few quarters here, a crumpled 5 there, but it gave her purpose. She wasn't just raising her son. She was building something for him, something bigger than they were. By the time Miles turned 3, his personality had bloomed like a late summer sunflower. He was curious in a way that made Clara's heart race. He wanted to know how everything worked. He would sit with his toy rocket for hours, trying to open it up to see what was inside. He once pulled apart a flashlight, and when Clara asked what he was doing, he said, "I want to find the light." She didn't have the heart to stop him. It became their thing, asking questions. Every evening after dinner, they'd sit out on the porch, wrapped in a shared quilt, and Miles would point at the stars. Why do they twinkle? Do they talk to each other? Are we moving, or is the sky moving? Clara didn't always have answers, but she never told him to stop asking. She started calling those nights their Friday sky talks. Nora would join sometimes, a steaming mug in hand, throwing in her own stories about constellations and ancient myths. Miles would listen, eyes wide, believing every word. And Clara would look at them both, the grandmother who saved her, the son who saved her again, and wonder how she'd ever almost lost all of this. At the bookstore, things shifted too. Maureen offered Clara more responsibility, organizing readings, curating new titles. Clara built a monthly open mic night called Truth on Tuesdays, where local writers could come and share. She read her poems for the first time one evening, hands shaking, voice trembling, but when she looked up, she saw a room full of strangers listening like her words mattered. One of those nights, a small publisher from Portland approached her. "I want to talk about your work," he said, handing her his card. It felt impossible, but a year later she held the first printed copy of her poetry collection, Gravity and Grace. On the dedication page it read, "For Miles, my center of gravity. For Nora, my compass." The launch was small but powerful. Nora cried. Miles clapped as if it were the greatest thing he'd ever seen. Life wasn't perfect. Bills were still tight. There were moments Clara felt overwhelmed, unsure, but there was structure now, joy, a sense of forward motion. Nora's health, though, began to slow. She still moved with that quiet strength, but Clara saw the tiredness creeping in, the stiffness in her hands, the longer naps, the soft winces when standing too long. Clara took on more around the house without saying anything. It wasn't a burden. It felt like balance. One quiet night, Miles fell asleep on the porch after one of their sky talks. Clara carried him inside and laid him gently in bed, then joined Nora in the kitchen. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock. "You know," Nora said at last, "I wasn't sure I'd live long enough to see you stand again. But you've done more than that. You've flown." Clara smiled, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Nora reached out, her hand rough but warm. "You would have. It just would have been harder. But you're made of tougher stuff than most people." It was a simple moment, but for Clara, it was one she'd carry with her. Not all validation came from the ones who broke you. Sometimes it came from those who picked you up and never asked you to pretend. Miles started kindergarten in the fall. Clara stood at the classroom door longer than she meant to, watching him wave from the cubby where he hung his backpack. He looked so small, so sure, like he belonged. She walked home that day, feeling both proud and suddenly empty, like a chapter had ended. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she found a note from Nora and a steaming cup of tea. "You've made it this far," the note read. "Keep going. The sky's still full of questions, and I think you have a few more answers in you yet." Clara sat down, sipped the tea, and looked out the window toward the fading horizon. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The smell of cinnamon and old books lingered in the air as Clara wiped down the counter at Page Turner's, her arms tired from the long shift. The shop had been quiet that day. Just a few regulars coming in for their usual mystery novels or poetry collections, and the familiar background hum of Nora's jazz CDs that Clara always played when she closed. It was early November, the kind of chilly day when the wind came through your jacket, and you remembered every scar winter had left behind. Clara welcomed the quiet. After everything, after the storms of her teenage years, the chaos of new motherhood, and the uphill journey of rebuilding from nothing, silence had become a gift. But just as she began turning off the lights, the doorbell chimed one last time. He walked in like he didn't quite belong, shaking rain from a navy wool coat and glancing around like he was looking for someone or something familiar. Clara had grown accustomed to reading people. This man wasn't from around here. His posture was too precise, the lines on his coat too sharp. His shoes were the kind that didn't belong on wet sidewalks. Still, he didn't look arrogant, just exhausted. He smiled when he caught her eye. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were closing," he said, voice warm and low. Clara set the rag aside. "No worries. You've got about 5 minutes before I officially lock up. Anything I can help you find?" "I'm looking for something distracting," he said, glancing toward the fiction section. "Rough day?" She nodded toward a table of staff picks. "We've all had those. I recommend Vonnegut if you want something cynical and weird. Or Atwood if you're feeling brave." He chuckled, walking over to the table and picking up a copy of Cat's Cradle. "Let's go with weird today." She rang him up, sliding the book into a brown paper bag. "Thanks," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'm Elliot." "Clara," she replied, offering a polite smile, then added, "And you're officially my last customer today." "Well then, Clara, thank you for the rescue. Maybe I'll come back for Atwood next time." He left with another smile, one that lingered longer than it should have. Clara didn't expect to see him again, but Elliot Hayes came back the following week. This time for The Handmaid's Tale, just as promised. Then again the next week, asking for poetry suggestions. Then again with a recommendation of his own, a quiet little novel by a Japanese author Clara had never heard of. Slowly he became part of the shop's rhythm, never pushing, never asking too much. He'd sit in the back corner with a cup of coffee, sometimes reading, sometimes just staring out the window like he was waiting for the world to explain itself. Over time, they talked more. About books, about music, even about parenting. After Elliot noticed a drawing Miles had made taped behind the register. "Your son?" he asked, pointing to the crayon rocket and messy stars. Clara nodded. "He's 6, thinks he'll be the first kid to land on Saturn." Elliot's eyes brightened. "Ambitious. I like it." He never pried, never asked about Miles's father or why Clara's eyes sometimes looked older than her 24 years. He didn't need to. There was something about Elliot that understood how silence could be sacred. It wasn't until late December during a snowstorm that shut the entire town down that Clara really saw him. The shop had closed early and Nora had taken Miles to her sister's for the weekend. Clara was locking the front when she saw Elliot standing across the street, caught under a lamplight, collar pulled up against the cold. He spotted her, hesitated, then crossed. "You walking home?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "You?" "My hotel's about 10 blocks away. Mind if I walk with you?" She didn't. They talked the whole way. About everything and nothing. About his life in Portland, about the architecture firm he'd left, and the investment company he now worked with. About how sometimes starting over looked like failure to everyone else, but felt like salvation to you. When they reached Clara's porch, she didn't invite him in, but she didn't want him to leave either. "This might sound strange," he said, brushing snow off his sleeves, "but meeting you has made this town feel a lot less temporary." Clara opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. So she just nodded. The next time they saw each other, it was intentional. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became long talks under porch lights while Miles slept. Nora watched all of it with her quiet, knowing gaze, offering no commentary, just a gentle presence. One night, after Elliot had left, Nora said, "He looks at you like you're not a puzzle to solve. That matters." Still, Clara hesitated. After everything she'd been through, Everything she'd had to rebuild alone, the idea of letting someone in again terrified her. But Elliot was patient. When he met Miles officially, he didn't overwhelm him. He asked questions. He listened. When Miles showed him his telescope and explained the names of every planet he'd memorized, Elliot sat for an hour just watching the boy beam with joy. "Your son's brilliant," he told Clara that night. "The way he talks, he reminds me of the way people sound when they love something enough to fight for it." They started spending more time together. On Miles's 7th birthday, Elliot brought a box of hand-cut wooden stars, painted silver, and helped them hang them from the ceiling of his bedroom. "Now your rocket has a sky," he'd said. That night, as Clara watched Miles fall asleep beneath his hand-built galaxy, she realized her guard had fallen completely. Love had crept in, not loud or sudden, but steadily, with every small act of care. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. But she felt it. Spring brought with it a newness Clara hadn't expected. Page turners expanded and Maureen handed over more responsibility. Nora's health dipped slightly, but she insisted on tending to her garden every morning. Miles came home from school full of new obsessions: constellations, insect wings, the circulatory system. He wanted to know everything. And Elliot? Elliot stayed. One Saturday afternoon, Clara and Miles found him in their driveway, bent over a telescope kit. He looked up, smiling sheepishly. "I figured it was time for an upgrade." They assembled it together. That night, the three of them stood on the back lawn, watching Jupiter through the lens. Miles bounced on his toes, eyes wide. "Look, Mom, you can see the stripes." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She turned to Elliot. "Why are you doing all this?" He looked at her like the answer was obvious. "Because you're worth it." And maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to believe that too. The sound of bees hummed softly through the spring air as Clara knelt by the garden beds outside Nora's cottage, hands deep in the soil, planting the last of the marigolds Miles had insisted they grow. Behind her, laughter rang from the porch where Miles and Elliot sat, tangled in wires and small pieces of a robotics kit that Elliot had brought back from Portland. Clara could hear Miles explaining how the gears were supposed to connect, his voice animated and full of that stubborn precision he always used when he was building something that mattered. She paused, wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, and looked at them. Miles had started leaning on Elliot more and more, not in any forced or manipulated way, but like his growing heart had found a second axis of trust. Clara hadn't expected that. She hadn't prepared for the ease with which Elliot slipped into their lives, not as a replacement for anything lost, but as something entirely new. Elliot looked up, catching her eye, and offered that quiet smile of his, the one that seemed to ask nothing, demand nothing, only say, "I'm here." That evening, they all sat down to dinner on the back porch. Nora had made rosemary chicken, and Clara had tried her hand at a peach tart that didn't quite hold its shape, but earned Miles's enthusiastic approval anyway. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned watercolor blue, Miles excused himself to finish drawing in his bedroom. Nora lingered a bit longer, then slipped inside too, giving Clara a look that said more than words ever could. It was just her and Elliot now, with the crickets beginning their symphony and the scent of lemon verbena wafting in from the garden. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low and steady, "about the past few months." Clara leaned back in her chair, wine glass still in hand. "Dangerous habit," he chuckled. "Probably. But something's been growing inside me, a thought I can't shake." Clara tilted her head, half smiling. "Go on." Elliot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue box. Her breath caught. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he placed it on the table between them like something fragile. "I don't want to be just a chapter in your life, Clara. I want to be in every page. I want to be beside you when Miles becomes the man he's meant to be. I want to grow old listening to your poetry and watching you argue with garden weeds." He opened the box then. Inside was a simple ring, elegant and understated, a sapphire set in gold. "I love you," he said without fanfare or flourish. And I want to marry you. Clara didn't speak for several seconds. The world seemed to hold its breath. She looked down at the ring, then up at the man across from her. The one who had never asked her to be anything other than who she already was, who had laughed at her dry jokes, listened to her late-night fears, and carried groceries when Miles fell asleep in the car. A man who hadn't tried to erase her past, but had simply waited at the door until she let him into her present. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say whatever's true," Elliot replied. Clara's fingers hovered over the box. "I've been broken before. I know. I have scars. I see them. I'm still scared. I'll wait." She didn't cry, not then. She simply nodded, heart pounding. "Then yes," she said. "Yes." They didn't shout or dance. They just sat there, hands intertwined, the stars slowly revealing themselves overhead. The next morning, Clara told Nora, who smiled softly and pulled her granddaughter into a hug. "About damn time," she muttered into Clara's hair. Miles reacted with wide eyes and endless questions. Would Elliot live with them now? Would he get his own room? Would they have a wedding with cake? Clara answered what she could, promised what she meant, and found herself laughing more in that week than she had in years. But Elliot had one more surprise. A week after the proposal, he came home from work early, carrying a thick envelope in his hand and a look in his eyes that Clara couldn't read. "What's this?" she asked as he handed it to her. "Open it," he said. Inside was a formal letter. Letterhead from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, with bold type across the top. Full tuition scholarship award. Miles Hastings. Pre-med program. Clara's breath stopped. She scanned the letter twice, her hands trembling. "How?" she whispered. Elliot shrugged, but there was a gleam in his eye. "Connections, luck. A friend who owed me a favor. Mostly, it was Miles. His work, his passion. I just helped move the application where it needed to go." Clara stared at him, overwhelmed. "You did this?" "I didn't buy his future, Clara," Elliot said. "I helped the world see what you already knew was there." She rushed to her room, retrieved the coffee tin she had guarded for almost a decade, the one marked Miles's future. She spilled its contents on the table, faded dollar bills, a few coins, old ticket stubs. Then she looked at Elliot, eyes burning. "Take it," she said. "You paid for his dream, not me." But Elliot pushed the tin back toward her, his expression tender. "That's not how love works." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake beside Elliot, her fingers curled around his, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, hope, love. In the morning, she made a decision. She took some of the money from the tin and visited the tailor downtown. She gave them one instruction. A suit, navy blue, sleek, but with a corduroy collar, a nod to the first day she'd ever seen Elliot Hayes, half-soaked in coffee, laughing in the middle of her bookstore. When it was ready, she wrapped it in a black box and waited. The next weekend, she handed it to Elliot after breakfast, watching his brow furrow as he untied the ribbon. He lifted the jacket from the box, paused when he saw the collar, and then looked at her. "You remember?" he murmured. "I never forgot," Clara said. "Thank you for showing up, for choosing us, for being the future I never thought I could have." He pulled her into his arms, jacket and all, and held her like the answer to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. The road behind Clara was long. The road ahead was still uncertain. But she had learned that joy doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of small moments, a bookshop conversation, a child's laughter, a hand held under starlight, a suit with a corduroy collar. And for the first time since she had stood on that rainy sidewalk in Seattle with a duffel bag on her shoulder, Claire Hastings didn't feel like she was starting over. She felt like she was home. It had been nearly 15 years since Claire last saw her parents. In that time, seasons had passed like chapters, some cruel, some tender, some filled with a quiet kind of healing that only came with time. But memory, like old roots, never really let go, and neither did the part of her that still remembered what it felt like to be cast aside. It was early December when it happened. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, low and full of unfallen snow. Clara had spent the morning preparing cranberry scones in the kitchen while Miles worked quietly at the dining table, finishing a project on the digestive system. Elliot had stepped out to run errands, and Nora was napping in her chair near the fireplace, the steady rhythm of her breath echoing in the stillness. The knock on the door was soft, almost uncertain. Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved to answer it, expecting a delivery or perhaps one of the neighbors. But when she pulled the door open, she froze. Two figures stood on the porch, older, smaller than she remembered. Her mother, Susan, in a faded winter coat that looked too thin for the season, her eyes ringed with weariness. And next to her, Thomas, taller but stooped, as if gravity had finally won its war. They carried no bags, only the weight of years. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Susan was the first to speak. "Clara," she said, her voice barely audible, we saw the article in the paper about Miles, MIT. We didn't know how to reach you until now." Thomas took a shaky breath. "We came to say we're proud of him, of you." Clara didn't move, didn't speak. Her mind was a storm, images flashing too quickly to hold. Her father's red face the night he told her to leave. Her mother's silence as the door closed behind her. The way their voices had once felt like anchors, and how they'd become chains. Then she heard Miles behind her. "Mom?" he asked, confused. "Who are they?" Clara turned, heart pounding. Her eyes met his, then returned to the two strangers on the porch. She swallowed hard. "These," she said quietly, "are your grandparents." There was a long silence. Susan began to cry, quietly, hands trembling. Thomas stared at his daughter with eyes that were suddenly glassy. "I know we don't deserve to be here," he said. "We failed you. We see that now." Miles looked at Clara. "You never said I had grandparents." "Because they weren't ready to be," she said, her voice raw. "Not when it mattered most." Thomas stepped forward slightly. "We thought we were doing what was right back then, but we were wrong. Terribly wrong." Elliot's car pulled into the driveway, and he got out, pausing when he saw the scene unfolding. He walked to Clara's side without a word, resting a hand gently at the small of her back. Miles took a step closer to her, too, slipping his hand into hers. "We just want a chance to know you both," Susan whispered. "If you'll let us." Nora's voice rang out from behind them, startling everyone. "You waited too damn long." She stood in the doorway now, wrapped in a shawl, leaning heavily on her cane. Her expression was unreadable. "But you're here," she added after a long moment. "And maybe that's something." Clara hesitated. Everything in her screamed to shut the door, to protect what she had rebuilt so painstakingly. But something else, the part that had longed for this moment even when she told herself she didn't, held her still. Finally, she stepped aside. "You can come in," she said, "but this isn't a welcome. It's just tea." They entered slowly, uncertainly, and sat stiffly on the edge of the living room chairs. The house was warm with scent and memory. Clara poured the tea in silence. Miles sat beside her, watching everyone with quiet, intense eyes. Thomas glanced around, noticing the framed photos. Miles in his science fair ribbons, Clara reading at a local poetry night, Elliot holding Miles on his shoulders at the coast. "This is a beautiful home," he said, voice tentative. "It's more than that," Nora replied, settling into her chair. "It's a fortress, built by a girl you turned away." Susan flinched. "We know. Every year that passed, we wondered if you'd ever forgive us." Clara met her mother's eyes for the first time in over a decade. "I don't know if I can. But I also don't know if I want to spend the rest of my life carrying that night like a stone in my chest." Thomas's voice cracked. "We want to earn your trust back, not expect it." They talked for an hour. Not everything was said. Not everything could be. But something shifted, tentative, fragile. When they stood to leave, Thomas looked at Miles. "You're doing something incredible," he said. We're sorry we missed so much. We hope someday we can be a part of it." Miles looked at his mother, then at his grandfather. "I have the family I need," he said simply, "but maybe there's room for more." Later that evening, as the house settled into quiet again, Clara stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall. Elliot joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Like I opened a door I wasn't sure I ever wanted to." "But maybe you needed to." She nodded slowly. "They were wrong, and they still have a lot to make up for." Elliot's hand found hers. "Then let them earn it, or let them see what they missed. Either way, you didn't bend. You opened the door on your terms." Behind them, Nora's voice called out for another cup of chamomile. Miles was already curled on the couch with his astrophysics workbook, mumbling about quantum gravity. And Clara. She finally felt what she hadn't known she was waiting for. Not closure, but clarity. She had spent years building a new legacy, one brick at a time. And today, when the past came knocking, she answered it not with bitterness, but with strength. Because forgiveness wasn't surrender, it was sovereignty. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the scent of sage and butter drifting from the kitchen, sunlight pouring in through the lace curtains Nora had hung decades ago. The old brick house in Eugene, now freshly painted and filled with quiet laughter, bustled with warmth. Clara stood over the stove, ladling gravy into a chipped porcelain boat, her plaid apron dusted with flour. Miles was due any moment. He had texted at sunrise, "On my way, save me some cranberry sauce." And her heart had fluttered the way it always did when she saw his name on her screen. He was 22 now, a surgeon. The title still caught in her throat every time she said it aloud. Dr. Miles Hastings, her son, her miracle, her beginning. Elliot stood by the dining table, carefully carving the turkey with the practiced ease of someone who took pride in tradition. His hair had gone a little silver at the temples, but his hands were as steady as ever, and his patience remained limitless. It had been nearly a decade since he proposed to Clara under that violet sky, and not a day had passed where she questioned her answer. Rosie's Diner, the place where their paths had first truly crossed, now bore Clara's name on the ownership documents. When the original Rosie finally retired at 75, she handed over the keys to Clara with a wink and a warning, "Don't let it go corporate." Clara never did. She modernized the menu, kept the same cracked booths, and hired young servers with big dreams and nowhere else to start. She knew exactly what that felt like. The front door creaked open, and in came Miles, fresh off the highway, a duffel slung over his shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold. His dark hair had grown out, curling slightly at the edges, and the sharp jawline he'd inherited from his father had only grown more defined. But his eyes, Clara's hazel eyes, still held that spark of boyhood wonder. "Smells like home," he said, grinning as he stepped into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her. "God, I missed this." "You missed my stuffing," Clara teased, pulling back to study him. "Don't lie." "I missed both," he replied, winking. Elliot greeted him with a bear hug, and soon the table was surrounded by Nora, now 90 and still sharp as a tack, wrapped in a knit shawl and sipping chamomile. The fire crackled in the hearth. Clara set the final dish down and looked around at the family she'd fought for, the life she had crafted from dust and fear and hope. They sat, hands clasped, heads bowed, and gave thanks, not in words written in stone, but in the way they looked at each other, in the quiet reverence of togetherness. Halfway through dinner, Miles's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowned, and stood. "Sorry, emergency at the clinic. I've got to head back. They need me for a last-minute surgery." Clara nodded, understanding. This had become their rhythm. Moments together, always braced for the next call. She kissed his forehead, packed him a container of leftovers, and watched him disappear into the dusk with the sound of gravel crunching under his tires. He called that night, hours later, exhausted but exhilarated. Surgery was rough. Ruptured appendix. "But she's okay," he said, voice low. "I'm proud of you," Claire whispered. There was a pause. Something weird happened after, he added. Her husband, he hugged me, called me a miracle, and then he asked my mom's name. Clara froze. What did you say? I told him the truth, and his face went pale. He asked to meet you. What did you say? I told him no, but something about him felt off, familiar. I don't know. Probably nothing. Clara couldn't shake the feeling. Something in her bones stirred, old ghosts rattling their chains. 2 weeks later, Miles called again. He reached out, found my email somehow, wants to meet you, says it's important. Who is he? Clara asked. There was a pause. Paul Rowan? Her heart slammed against her ribs. Jake's father. The name hit her like a stone dropped in still water. Paul Rowan. The man who never came looking for her when she was 17, who never called, never wrote, who had, like his son, vanished. Clara sat in silence. What do you want me to do? Miles asked gently. Let him come, she said after a long pause. But I want to decide how. When Paul arrived in Eugene, it was snowing lightly. He stepped out of a weathered truck, older now, with eyes that searched the yard as if trying to find someone already lost. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, Elliot beside her. Miles opened the door for him quietly. This is my mom. Paul turned, eyes brimming. Clara, he said, you look just like... Don't, she interrupted. Don't say his name. He swallowed. I just want to say I'm sorry. I didn't know. Jake, he didn't tell us. He was scared. We thought he was just acting out. Then he left for Stanford. A year later, he got sick. Pancreatic cancer. He died before he ever told us what he ran from. Clara closed her eyes. I found out about Miles through the hospital paperwork, Paul continued, and then I saw his name online. I just needed to see him, to thank the woman who raised my grandson. You don't get to rewrite the past, Clara said, voice hard, but he does. She nodded toward Miles, who stood quietly watching. Paul looked at the young man before him. You saved my wife's life. You're extraordinary. And I know I don't deserve a place here. But if you ever want to know more about Jake, about our family, my door is open. He didn't ask for more. He just left his contact information on the table and walked back into the snow. After the door closed, Clara sat down, shaken. Miles walked over, rested a hand on her shoulder. I'm not him, he said gently. But I'm part of that story. I'm yours, always. But I might want to know the rest, too. She looked at him, that brave, brilliant boy she had carried, protected, built a world for, and she nodded. I'll walk that road with you. Just say when. Years later, at Miles's wedding in Vermont, Clara danced with him under a canopy of stars. Nora had passed the year before, her ashes scattered beneath the marigolds. Elliot held Clara's hand the entire ceremony. Thomas and Susan sat quietly in the back row, respectful, weeping. And Paul Rowan? He watched from a distance. The past never disappeared. But in the end, Clara learned it didn't have to. It could coexist with healing. It could hum beneath the surface like a forgotten lullaby, no longer haunting, just part of the song. She had lived through rejection, fear, solitude, but she had written something stronger. Legacy. Miles stood that night, his bride at his side, and toasted the woman who raised him. To my mother, he said, voice steady, you taught me the most important thing I'll ever know, that love isn't always loud, but it always shows up. You saved me. You made me. This life is your legacy. And in that moment, with the music rising and the future unfolding around her, Clara finally felt it. Peace. Clara Hastings' story is not one of a straight line, nor a perfectly tied bow at the end of a romantic tale. It's a story carved through storms, rebuilt from ashes, and etched with the unshakable grit of a woman who, when cast aside by the people who were supposed to love her most, chose to stand anyway. Her journey began at 17, not with dreams fulfilled, but with a door slammed shut. Her parents, rigid with fear and shame, told her she was no longer welcome when she revealed her pregnancy. Alone, heartbroken, carrying the weight of rejection and new life within her, Clara left everything behind with only a duffel bag and a fading sense of self-worth. What followed could have broken her. It didn't. Instead, it shaped her into someone stronger. With the quiet, unwavering support of her grandmother Nora, Clara began the long process of building a life, not just for herself, but for her son, Miles. It wasn't easy. There were nights she didn't sleep, days she wondered if she was doing anything right. But every small choice, a night shift at the bookstore, a lullaby whispered over a fevered forehead, the decision to keep going when it would have been easier to stop, was a brick in the foundation of the life she was crafting. And Miles, that child born from a moment of vulnerability, became her light. His curiosity, his tenacity, his brilliance, all of it mirrored the strength he had unknowingly inherited. From building paper rockets on the back porch to earning a full scholarship to MIT's pre-med program, Miles wasn't just Clara's reason to endure. He was the proof that her choices, no matter how hard, had mattered. Then came Elliot. Elliot didn't burst into Clara's world with grand gestures. He walked into her bookstore late one evening, wet from the rain, looking for something to read. What began as shared book recommendations and quiet conversations slowly evolved into something steady and sure. Elliot was patient, kind, and consistent in ways Clara had forgotten to hope for. He never asked her to forget the pain that had shaped her. Instead, he stood beside it, offering his own warmth until she no longer needed to shield herself from the cold. Their relationship didn't erase Clara's past, but it showed her that love, real love, isn't about fixing someone. It's about seeing all their pieces and choosing to stay anyway. Years later, when her parents finally resurfaced, humbled and sorrowful, Clara faced the hardest decision of all, whether to allow them back in. And yet, with all the dignity she'd earned, she didn't slam the door the way they once had. She opened it, not wide, but enough. Enough to begin healing, to show Miles that forgiveness isn't weakness, and to reclaim her power not through revenge, but through grace. The reappearance of Jake's father, Paul Rowan, only deepened this emotional reckoning. After discovering that Miles, the young surgeon who had saved his wife's life, was his grandson, Paul came searching not for redemption, perhaps, but for understanding. Clara, older now, wiser, didn't offer easy absolution, but she did what she had always done. She faced the truth, stood firm in her values, and allowed Miles to choose what kind of connection he wanted to build for himself. At the heart of this story is the idea that legacy is not about blood. It's about the people who show up. Nora, with her cane and quiet ferocity, was the first person who told Clara she was still whole. Elliot, who wore his heart in every small act, showed both Clara and Miles that love could be safe again. And Clara herself, the woman who once sat sobbing on a bus station bench, became the mother who gave a surgeon to the world. So, what do we learn from Clara's story? We learn that forgiveness is not for the people who hurt us. It's for the freedom we deserve to reclaim. We learn that family is not just defined by DNA, but by the hands that hold us when we break and the voices that believe in us when we doubt. We learn that it's okay to start over, again and again, until you find the life that truly fits. Clara's story is a reminder that the worst days can become the root of the best chapters, if only we have the courage to keep turning the page. And more importantly, it shows us how to apply this to our own lives. Don't define yourself by the moments that almost broke you. Define yourself by the strength it took to survive them. If someone has hurt you, you get to decide how and if they're allowed back in. That's your power. And if you've made mistakes, big ones, own them. Show up. Speak the apology out loud. There's no expiration date on trying to do better. Now let's take a moment to engage your heart and your thoughts with a quick question. Imagine you were in Clara's shoes the day Paul Rowan, her son's grandfather and the father of the man who abandoned her, came asking for a meeting after years of silence. Would you have A, let him into your home for a conversation, even cautiously, or B, closed the door and protected the peace you'd finally built? Comment below with your answer, A or B, and tell us why. Your perspective might just help someone else wrestling with their own crossroads. What would you have done in Clara's place? What did you feel when you heard her parents apologize, or when Miles said he already had the family he needed? Drop your reflections in the comments. We truly want to hear your voice. Let's grow this space together into a community where real stories spark real conversations. And if you found yourself moved, inspired, or simply comforted by this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories like Clara's, stories that honor pain, celebrate growth, and remind us all that even in the darkest moments, there is still light ahead.